My husband screamed, "Our son died because of you," and emptied my account. I found him at the casino, with someone else. The words still echo through every corner of my soul, each syllable a dagger that refuses to dull. In that moment, standing in our kitchen in Brooklyn, watching the man I'd loved for 32 years transform into a stranger, I felt something inside me die too. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share, and if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Margaret, and I'm 71 years old. For the past 3 years, I've been living with a grief so heavy it feels like carrying a suitcase full of stones everywhere I go. My son David died of leukemia at 35, leaving behind a world that suddenly felt too quiet, too empty, too cold. But what nearly destroyed me wasn't just losing him. It was discovering that the people I'd spent my entire life protecting, nurturing, and sacrificing for had been planning my destruction all along. Every morning, I wake up in my small apartment on 5th Avenue in Park Slope, Brooklyn. The wooden floors creak with the same familiar sound they've made for 15 years, but now that creaking feels different. It sounds lonely. The scent of Maxwell House coffee mingles with the mustiness of old books I can no longer focus on reading. On the mantel, David's photos watch me move through my daily routine like a ghost haunting her own life. Before everything fell apart, my days followed a pattern worn smooth by decades of devotion. Wake at 6, make coffee for Richard, my husband of 32 years. Prepare his breakfast exactly how he liked it. 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast cut diagonally, orange juice in the small glass, never the large one. Iron his shirts while he showered, making sure the collar was perfect because God forbid someone at his insurance office saw a wrinkle. I'd spend my mornings cleaning our house in Bay Ridge, the one we bought when David was 12 and our daughter Sarah was 15. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a small backyard where I grew tomatoes and basil. Richard always complained about the mortgage, but I loved that house. It represented everything I'd worked for, everything I'd dreamed of giving my children. My afternoons belonged to other people's needs. David's medical appointments after his diagnosis, driving him to chemotherapy sessions at Memorial Sloan Kettering, holding his hand while poison dripped into his veins, promising him everything would be okay, even when the doctors' faces told a different story, shopping for groceries, cooking dinner, making sure everyone had clean clothes and full bellies and someone to listen to their problems. I worked part-time at the Brooklyn Public Library on Court Street, shelving books and helping people find stories that might comfort them the way books had always comforted me. $22 an hour, 15 hours a week. Not much, but it was mine. My own small contribution to our household, my own tiny piece of independence. I loved the quiet dignity of that work, the way grateful patrons would smile when I helped them locate the perfect novel or research material for their college essays. But even that simple job became another source of guilt. Richard would roll his eyes when I mentioned my work. "Playing librarian again?" he'd say, as if my desire to be useful outside our home was some childish game. Maybe you should focus on what actually matters. What actually mattered, according to Richard, was keeping everyone happy, making sure David had everything he needed during his illness, sending money to Sarah when her husband lost his job, covering the cost of private school for our grandchildren because public school in their neighborhood wasn't good enough, paying for family vacations I couldn't afford because family time is priceless. I had $53,000 in my savings account, money I'd accumulated over 20 years of careful budgeting, coupon clipping, buying generic brands, and saying no to myself so I could say yes to everyone else. I'd saved that money by eating leftovers while preparing fresh meals for my family, by wearing the same winter coat for 8 years while buying new ones for the grandkids, by cutting my own hair instead of going to a salon. That money represented every small sacrifice I'd made, every time I chose their needs over mine. It was my security blanket, my proof that I was a good wife and mother, my insurance policy against an uncertain future. I never spent it frivolously. I never even spent it on necessities for myself unless absolutely unavoidable. When David got sick, I didn't hesitate. "Take whatever you need from my account," I told Richard. "Nothing matters except helping him get well." $15,000 for experimental treatments not covered by insurance. $8,000 for a second opinion from a specialist in Boston. $12,000 for medications that promised hope but delivered disappointment. Thousands more for hospital bills, parking fees, hotel costs during out-of-town treatments, medical equipment he needed at home. I gave it all gladly. What good is money when your child is dying? But David died anyway. On a Tuesday morning in October, with autumn light filtering through his hospital window and his hand growing cold in mine. I watched the life leave his eyes and felt something fundamental break inside me, something that would never heal the same way. The funeral cost $18,000. Richard chose the expensive casket, the elaborate flower arrangements, the catered reception afterward. "He deserves the best," he said, and I agreed, even though my savings account balance dropped to $8,000. Even though I knew David would have preferred something simpler, more intimate. At the reception, held in the basement of St. Francis Church on President Street, I moved through crowds of mourners like I was underwater. People hugged me, whispered condolences, told me stories about David's kindness. But I felt separate from it all, wrapped in a grief so thick it muffled every sound, dulled every color. That's when I first noticed something strange. Richard kept disappearing. One moment he'd be standing beside me accepting sympathy from neighbors. The next moment he'd vanished. When he returned, he'd smell like cigarettes even though he quit smoking 10 years ago. His eyes would dart around the room nervously, never quite meeting mine. "Where do you keep going?" I asked him once, gently, careful not to sound accusatory. "Getting air," he snapped. "Can't a man grieve in peace?" I spent the weeks after David's funeral moving through life like a sleepwalker. Richard went back to work immediately. "Staying busy helps," he explained, though I noticed he started working later, coming home after 8 o'clock most nights. Sarah called occasionally, but our conversations felt strained, formal. She was dealing with her own grief, her own life challenges. The house felt enormous and empty. I'd find myself setting 3 places at the dinner table out of habit, then having to put one away. I'd cook too much food and eat alone while it grew cold. The silence became unbearable, so I started leaving the television on just to hear human voices, even if they were selling vacuum cleaners or discussing political scandals I couldn't make myself care about. 2 months after David's funeral, I got a text message that changed everything. It was from Sarah, but it wasn't meant for me. The message read, "Dad says Mom's being dramatic about the money. Tell him to stop being so obvious about it." I stared at that message for 10 minutes, reading it over and over, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. What money was I being dramatic about? What was Richard being obvious about? Why were my husband and daughter discussing my behavior behind my back? That evening, I asked Richard about it, showed him the text message, explained how confused I was. His face went through several expressions: surprise, anger, something that looked almost like fear. Then his features hardened into the cold mask I'd been seeing more often lately. "You're paranoid," he said, not even looking at the phone. "Sarah's going through a difficult time. People say things they don't mean when they're grieving." But I wasn't paranoid. I was heartbroken and confused and desperately lonely, but I wasn't paranoid. Something was wrong, and deep down, I knew it. The next morning, while Richard was at work, I did something I'd never done before. I logged into our joint checking account online and looked at our recent financial activity. What I saw made my stomach drop like I was falling off a cliff. Withdrawals, hundreds of them. Small amounts, usually $200 or $300 at a time, always from ATMs I didn't recognize. Locations in Queens, Manhattan, even New Jersey. Places I'd never been. made by someone using my debit card while I was at home grieving my son. The withdrawals started 3 weeks after David's funeral. They happened almost daily, always during business hours when Richard was supposedly at work. In 6 weeks, $8,000 had disappeared from our account. My remaining savings, the last of what I'd worked 20 years to accumulate, was being drained away $50, $100 at a time. I printed the bank statements with hands that shook so badly I could barely operate the computer mouse. Then, I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by pages of evidence, and tried to understand what I was looking at. My husband was stealing from me. The man I'd loved and trusted and sacrificed everything for was systematically emptying our bank account while I grieved our son's death. He was taking the money I'd saved through decades of self-denial and using it for something he couldn't or wouldn't tell me about. When Richard came home that evening, I was waiting in the living room with the bank statements spread across the coffee table like accusations. "What's this?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. He glanced at the papers, and I watched his face go through the same sequence of emotions I'd seen the night before: surprise, anger, fear. But this time, the mask didn't fall into place. This time, I saw something else. Guilt. Pure, undeniable guilt. "I can explain," he began. "Then explain. Explain why you've been stealing money from our account. Explain why you've been lying about where you go during the day. Explain why our daughter thinks I'm being dramatic about money I didn't even know was missing." The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Outside, Brooklyn evening traffic hummed past our windows. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed. Normal city sounds from a world that suddenly felt anything but normal. "I borrowed some money," he finally said. "I was going to pay it back." "Borrowed? You stole $8,000 from our joint account without telling me, and you call that borrowing? It's my money too." Those words hit me like a physical blow. My money too. As if everything I'd worked for, everything I'd saved, everything I'd contributed to our life together was somehow his by right. As if my sacrifices were meaningless, my labor invisible, my needs irrelevant. "Where did the money go, Richard?" His jaw tightened. "That's not your concern." "My savings disappearing isn't my concern? The money I worked 20 years to save isn't my concern. You don't understand the pressure I'm under." "What pressure?" "Help me understand. Make me understand why you had to steal from your grieving wife instead of talking to me, instead of asking, instead of treating me like a human being deserving of basic honesty." But he wouldn't explain. He stormed out of the house, slamming the front door so hard that David's photos rattled on the mantel. I sat alone in the living room until midnight, surrounded by bank statements and broken trust, wondering how my life had become so unrecognizable. The next morning, Richard was gone before I woke up. He'd left no note, no explanation, no apology. Just an empty coffee mug in the sink and the lingering scent of his aftershave. I spent that day trying to piece together the scope of what had been done to me. I called the bank and learned that Richard had requested ATM cards for both of our individual accounts, not just the joint checking. He'd been making withdrawals from my personal savings account too, the one I'd assumed was safe because only my name was on it. But we'd been married for 32 years. In New York State, that meant he had legal access to anything I owned, just as I had legal access to anything he owned. Marriage, I learned that day, isn't just about love and commitment. It's also about vulnerability. It's about giving someone the power to destroy you and trusting them not to use it. By the time I finished my phone calls and online searches, I understood the full extent of my financial devastation. Richard had emptied everything: our joint checking account, my personal savings, even a small retirement account I'd been contributing to through my library job. $53,000 gone. 20 years of careful financial planning, obliterated in 6 weeks of systematic theft. That evening, I did something I'd never done before. I called Richard's office and asked to speak with him. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Thompson," his secretary said. "Richard hasn't been in the office for 3 weeks. I assumed you knew he was taking extended bereavement leave." Bereavement leave. While I'd been home grieving alone, assuming my husband was coping by staying busy at work, he'd actually been somewhere else entirely, using my money, lying to everyone, including his employer. "Do you know how I can reach him?" I asked. "It's important." "I'm sorry, but he asked us not to give out his contact information. He said he needed space to process his loss." His loss, as if David had been Richard's son alone. As if I wasn't David's mother, wasn't grieving just as deeply, wasn't entitled to know where my husband was spending his days and my money. I hung up the phone and sat in my empty house, surrounded by the life I'd built through decades of service and sacrifice, and finally understood what David had been trying to tell me during his last weeks of life. "Mom," he'd whispered one afternoon while we sat in his hospital room watching snow fall over Manhattan, "promise me you won't let people take advantage of you when I'm gone." At the time, I'd thought he was talking about strangers, scam artists who preyed on elderly widows. I never imagined he was warning me about his own father. "Promise me," he'd repeated, his voice urgent despite his weakness. "I promise," I'd said, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. I'd failed him. I'd broken my promise to my dying son. That night, I barely slept. Every sound in the house seemed amplified. The radiator clanking, the refrigerator humming, the floorboards settling. I kept expecting Richard to come home, to explain everything, to apologize and promise to make things right. He didn't come home. The next morning, I made coffee for one person for the first time in 32 years. I ate toast cut into squares instead of triangles because I'd only cut them diagonally for Richard's preferences, never my own. I got dressed and took the subway into Manhattan, something I rarely did alone. I spent the day walking through Central Park, watching joggers and dog walkers and elderly couples feeding pigeons on benches. I studied their faces, wondering if any of them had ever discovered that their entire life was built on lies. If any of them had ever felt as completely alone as I did in that moment. That evening, I came home to find Richard sitting at our kitchen table. He looked tired, older somehow. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair uncombed. For a moment, I felt a flicker of the old compassion, the instinctive urge to take care of him. Then I remembered my empty bank accounts. "Where have you been?" I asked. "Thinking," he said. "Trying to figure out how to fix this." "Fix what?" "The money situation." The money situation. As if my financial devastation was a minor inconvenience, a household repair that needed attention. "Where did my money go, Richard?" He was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I have a gambling problem." The words hung in the air between us like smoke. I heard them, understood their meaning, but couldn't quite process their implications. A gambling problem? It started small, just a few dollars here and there, something to take my mind off David's illness. But it got worse after he died. I couldn't stop thinking about everything we'd lost, everything we'd never get back. The casino made me feel like maybe I could win something for once, like maybe I could get back some of what life had taken from us. The casino? Resorts World in Queens. Sometimes Atlantic City when I could get away for longer. I thought about all those ATM withdrawals, all those locations I didn't recognize. My husband had been driving to casinos while I assumed he was at work. He'd been gambling away my life savings while I grieved alone at home. "How much did you lose?" "Everything," he said. "Everything and more." More? I owed some people money. The kind of people you don't want to owe money to. That's why I had to take yours, to pay them back. My legs gave out. I sank into the chair across from him, staring at this stranger who used to be my husband. "You gambled away $53,000? I was going to win it back. I had a system, a strategy. I just needed a little more time, a little more capital. Capital. You mean more of my money? Our money. We're married, Margaret. What's yours is mine. There it was again. That casual dismissal of my autonomy, my right to have something of my own in this world. What's yours is mine, but never what's mine is yours. I'd spent 32 years building a life with a man who saw my contributions as his property. Get out, I said. What? Get out of my house. Our house, Margaret. And you don't mean that. You're upset, which I understand. But I mean it. Get out. Get out now. I watched him realize I was serious, watched his face cycle through disbelief, anger, and something that might have been fear. You can't just throw me out. I have rights. This is my home too. The home whose mortgage I helped pay for 32 years. The home I maintained while you were at casinos stealing my money? That home? I never meant for it to go this far. But it did go that far. You stole everything I'd saved and gambled it away while I grieved our son. You lied to me, to your employer, to everyone. You betrayed every vow we made to each other. People make mistakes, Margaret. I'm willing to go to counseling, to get help. We can work through this. No, we can't, because you didn't make a mistake. You made a choice. Hundreds of choices. Every time you went to that casino, every time you used my ATM card, every time you lied about where you'd been, you chose your addiction over our marriage. He tried to argue, to bargain, to manipulate me into forgiveness the way he'd manipulated me into everything else over the years. But something fundamental had shifted inside me. For the first time in decades, I could see clearly. I could see him clearly. He was not a victim of overwhelming grief who'd made some poor financial decisions. He was a man who'd systematically exploited my trust and stolen my security while I was at my most vulnerable. He was a man who'd gambled away our future and then blamed me for being upset about it. I said, get out. Where am I supposed to go? I don't know, and I don't care. Figure it out the same way you figured out how to steal from me. He left that night, but not quietly. He screamed at me, called me heartless and vindictive. He told me I was destroying our family, that David would be ashamed of me for breaking up his parents' marriage. Our son died because of you, he finally shouted, his face twisted with rage. If you hadn't pushed him so hard to keep fighting, he could have died peacefully instead of suffering through all that treatment. You killed him with your selfishness, and now you're killing our marriage the same way. Those words hit me like a physical assault. I actually staggered backward, grabbing the kitchen counter for support. Because somewhere, in the deepest, darkest part of my grief, I'd wondered the same thing. I'd wondered if I'd pushed David to endure treatments that caused more pain than they prevented. I'd wondered if I'd been selfish in wanting to keep him alive, if I'd prioritized my need to have my son over his need to be free from suffering. Richard saw my reaction and pressed his advantage. You know it's true. You know you care more about controlling people than loving them. David saw it. Sarah sees it. Everyone sees it except you. But even in my pain, even through my tears, I recognized the manipulation. Richard was taking my deepest fear, my most vulnerable wound, and weaponizing it against me. He was trying to make me believe that loving my son too much was a character flaw, that fighting for his life was somehow selfish. Get out, I whispered. You'll regret this. You'll realize what you've thrown away, and it'll be too late. Get out now. He finally left, slamming every door between the kitchen and the front of the house. I heard his car start in the driveway, heard him rev the engine unnecessarily before speeding away into the Brooklyn night. Then I was alone. Truly, completely alone in a way I'd never been before. I sank onto my kitchen floor and cried until I had no tears left. I cried for David, for the life we'd lost, and the future we'd never have. I cried for my marriage, for 32 years of what I'd thought was love, but now recognized as servitude. I cried for my money, for the security I'd worked so hard to build and lost so completely. I cried for the version of myself I'd been before I understood how little my own family valued me. But when the tears finally stopped, when I pulled myself up off that cold linoleum floor, I felt something unexpected. Relief. For the first time in months, maybe years, I was alone, but I wasn't afraid. The house was quiet, but it wasn't oppressively so. It was peacefully so. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in David's old bedroom, surrounded by his books and photographs and the baseball trophies he'd won in high school. I talked to him the way I'd done during his final days in the hospital. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'm sorry I let him steal from us. I'm sorry I broke my promise to you. But I won't let anyone take advantage of me ever again." The room was silent, but I swear I felt David's presence somehow. Not in a supernatural way, but in the way children live on in their parents' hearts. In the way love survives even death. The next morning, I woke up to discover that trying to survive on my own was going to be much harder than I'd anticipated. Richard had cleaned out our joint checking account completely before leaving. I had exactly $63 in my wallet and no access to any other money. I called the bank and learned that I couldn't close our joint accounts without Richard's signature. I couldn't even change the passwords or restrict his access. As long as we were legally married, he could continue to take money from any account with his name on it, even if he was no longer living in our home. I called a lawyer and learned that getting a divorce would take months and cost thousands of dollars I no longer had. I called my daughter Sarah and discovered that she already knew about Richard's gambling problem, had known for weeks, and hadn't thought to warn me. "I didn't want to upset you while you were still grieving David," she explained, her voice stiff with discomfort. "Dad said he was handling it." "Handling it? He stole $53,000 from me, Sarah. He gambled away every penny I'd saved in 20 years, and you think he was handling it? I don't want to get involved in your marriage problems, Mom." "Marriage problems? This isn't about marriage problems. This is about theft. This is about your father committing financial abuse against me while I grieved your brother's death." "You're being dramatic." There it was. The phrase from the text message she'd accidentally sent me. I was being dramatic about having my life savings stolen. I was being dramatic about discovering that my husband was a compulsive gambler who'd been lying to me for months. I was being dramatic about wanting basic honesty and respect in my marriage. "I need help," I said. "I need money for groceries, for utilities, for a lawyer. Your father left me with nothing. I can't get involved in this. You and Dad need to work out your own problems." She hung up on me. My daughter, who I'd supported through her divorce, who I'd helped raise her children, who I'd given money to whenever she needed it, hung up on me when I asked for help. That afternoon, I swallowed my pride and called my sister Joan in Manhattan. We'd grown apart over the years, partly because Richard had always found reasons why we couldn't visit her, why she couldn't stay with us, why family gatherings had to be abbreviated or canceled. "Margaret." Joan sounded surprised to hear from me. "Is everything okay?" I explained what had happened, trying to keep my voice steady and factual. Joan listened without interrupting, making small sounds of sympathy and disbelief. "Oh, honey," she said when I finished. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea things were that bad. Can I borrow some money? Just enough to hire a lawyer to get the divorce started." I wish I could, but Harold and I are barely getting by ourselves since he retired. The market has been terrible for our investments, and we're living on Social Security and whatever dividends we can manage. I understood. Joan and her husband Harold had worked modest jobs their whole lives. They didn't have thousands of dollars lying around to lend to relatives, no matter how desperate those relatives might be. But I was desperate. I was a 71-year-old woman with $63 to my name and a husband who might return at any moment to take even that. That evening, I did something I'd never done before. I went through our house systematically, looking for anything I could sell. Richard's tools in the garage, worth maybe $300. my grandmother's china, which might bring another 200 at an antique shop, some jewelry I'd inherited from my mother. I felt like I was dismantling my own life piece by piece, converting memories into cash just to survive. The next morning, I took the subway to a pawn shop in Flatbush. The owner, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and gentle hands, examined my mother's wedding ring and pearl necklace. "These are beautiful pieces," he said, "but I can only give you $400 for both." "They're worth at least twice that." "At retail, yes. But I have to be able to resell them at a profit. 400 is the best I can do." I took the money. What choice did I have? With that $400 plus the $63 from my wallet, I had enough to pay for a month of groceries and utilities, but I needed thousands for a lawyer, for filing fees, for the cost of starting over at 71. That night, as I sat in my empty house eating canned soup and crackers, I thought about David again, about the promise I'd made him and the promise I'd made myself. I wouldn't let anyone take advantage of me again. But I was beginning to understand that keeping that promise was going to be harder than I'd imagined. 3 days after pawning my mother's jewelry, I was standing in my kitchen making coffee when I heard a key in the front door. My heart started racing. Only 2 people had keys to this house, me and Richard. He walked into the kitchen like he still belonged there, car keys jingling in his hand, looking better than he had the night I'd thrown him out. His clothes were clean and pressed. His hair was combed. He'd shaved. "Good morning, Margaret." "What are you doing here?" "I live here. This is my home." "I told you to leave. You were upset. I understood that. But I'm not going to let you destroy our family because you're angry about some money." Some money. $53,000 was some money to him. My entire life savings, accumulated through decades of sacrifice, was just some money. Get out of my house. Our house. And I'm not leaving. I spoke to a lawyer yesterday. As long as we're married, I have every legal right to live here. You can't force me out without a court order, and court orders take time. He poured himself coffee using my favorite mug, the one David had given me for Mother's Day 15 years ago. Watching him drink from that mug felt like a violation. "I also spoke to the bank," he continued. "Our accounts will remain joint until the divorce is finalized, however long that takes. You can't keep stealing from me." "I'm not stealing. I'm accessing marital assets. That's what the bank called it. Marital assets." I stared at this man I'd once loved, this stranger wearing my husband's face, and realized that he'd spent the past 3 days not getting help for his gambling addiction, or figuring out how to make amends for what he'd done to me. He'd spent them talking to lawyers and banks, finding ways to continue exploiting me legally. "Why?" I asked. "Why are you doing this to me?" "Because you're my wife. Because we made vows to each other. For better or worse, remember? In sickness and in health?" Those vows included loving and cherishing. They included honoring and respecting. When did you last do any of those things? I'm trying to save our marriage. By stealing from me? By lying to me? By gambling away my future security? I made mistakes. I'm willing to admit that. But mistakes don't erase 32 years of marriage. What about 32 years of me putting your needs above mine? What about 32 years of me working and saving and sacrificing so you could have everything you wanted? Does that count for anything? He was quiet for a moment, studying my face. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, more manipulative. "I know you're hurting, Margaret. I know losing David changed you. But you can't let grief make you do something you'll regret forever." "The only thing I regret is not seeing who you really were sooner. I'm the same man you married. I'm the same man who raised children with you, who built this life with you. One mistake doesn't erase everything we've had together. This wasn't one mistake. This was months of deliberate deception. This was you systematically stealing from your grieving wife and then blaming her when she found out." Richard set down the mug and moved closer to me. For a moment, I was afraid he might become physically violent. But instead, he did something worse. He reached out and touched my face with false tenderness. "I love you, Margaret. I always have. Let me make this right." And God help me, for just a second, I almost believed him. For just a second, I wanted to believe that love could fix what had been broken. That marriage meant something more than legal exploitation. That 32 years counted for more than $53,000. Then I remembered David's warning. I remembered my promise to myself. "Get your hands off me." Richard's expression hardened. The manipulative tenderness disappeared, replaced by the cold anger I'd seen the night he left. "Fine. If you want to play it that way, we'll play it that way. But you should know that I'm not the only one who thinks you're handling this badly." "What does that mean?" "I talked to Sarah yesterday. She's concerned about your mental state, about the decisions you're making." Sarah refused to help me when I called her. Because she thinks you need professional help. She thinks grief has made you paranoid and vindictive. Vindictive? For not wanting to be robbed by my own husband? For throwing away a 32-year marriage over money? You threw away our marriage when you decided to gamble away my future security. Sarah thinks you might benefit from some time in a facility where you can get the help you need. The threat was clear. Richard and Sarah were discussing having me committed, declared mentally incompetent, removed from my own home and placed in some kind of psychiatric facility where I couldn't interfere with their narrative. "You can't do that," I said, but my voice shook. "Can't I? You're a 71-year-old woman whose son just died. You're displaying erratic behavior, making impulsive financial decisions, isolating yourself from family. A judge might think you need protection from yourself." I stared at him, finally understanding the full scope of what I was facing. This wasn't just about money. This wasn't just about gambling addiction or marital problems. This was about Richard maintaining control over me by any means necessary, even if it meant having me declared legally incompetent. Sarah would never. Sarah wants what's best for you. We all do. But if you keep acting irrationally, we might have to make some difficult decisions. He left me standing in my kitchen, shaking with fear and rage, while he went upstairs to our bedroom like nothing had changed. I heard him moving around up there, opening dresser drawers, running water in the bathroom sink. Normal. Domestic sounds that felt anything but normal. I spent that day researching elder abuse laws on the computer at the Brooklyn Public Library where I worked. I learned that financial exploitation of elderly people was common, that family members were often the perpetrators, that proving abuse was difficult when the victim was married to the abuser. I also learned that having someone declared incompetent required proof of mental impairment, court hearings, psychiatric evaluations. It wasn't something Richard could do overnight, no matter how much he threatened me. But the fact that he was threatening it at all told me everything I needed to know about his character. The man I'd married would never have considered having me committed to protect his access to money. The man I'd loved would never have used our daughter as a weapon against me. This man, this stranger living in my house and drinking from my dead son's mug, was capable of anything. That evening, Richard tried a different approach. He cooked dinner, pasta with sauce from a jar, nothing elaborate, and set the table for two. "I thought we could eat together," he said. "Talk about how to move forward." "I'm not hungry." "You have to eat, Margaret. You've lost weight since David died." It was true. Grief had stolen my appetite along with everything else. But I didn't want his false concern or his manipulative gestures of care. I said I'm not hungry. "Then sit with me while I eat, please. Let's at least try to be civil." Civil. As if civility was something he deserved after what he'd done to me. But I sat down anyway, partly because I was tired of fighting, and partly because I wanted to understand what he was thinking, how he justified his actions to himself, how he planned to continue living in this house with a woman he'd betrayed so completely. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, twirling pasta on his fork. About the money, about the gambling. You're right that I should have talked to you first. Should have talked to me? Richard, you stole $53,000 from me. I know it looks bad. It doesn't look bad. It is bad. It's theft. It's elder abuse. It's financial exploitation. But I was desperate, Margaret. I was grieving and scared and not thinking clearly. You've never dealt with addiction. You don't know how it changes your brain, how it makes you do things you never thought you'd do. So this is addiction's fault? Partly, yes. Gambling addiction is a real medical condition. It's not a character flaw or moral failing. It's an illness. I studied his face as he spoke, looking for signs of genuine remorse or recognition of what he'd done to me. Instead, I saw calculation. He was testing different approaches, trying to find the combination of words that would make me forgive him and give him access to whatever money I might still have. Have you gotten help for this illness? I'm looking into treatment programs. Looking into them? These things take time, Margaret. There are waiting lists, insurance approvals. But you had time to research your legal rights regarding our bank accounts in this house. His jaw tightened. I had to protect myself. You threw me out without warning. I needed to understand my options. Protect yourself? From what? From you destroying everything we've built together because you're grieving and not thinking straight. And what exactly have we built together, Richard? A marriage where you steal from me and then blame me for being upset about it? A family where our daughter thinks I'm being dramatic for not wanting to be robbed? What exactly am I supposed to fight to preserve? He was quiet for several minutes, mechanically eating pasta while I sat across from him in the kitchen where I'd prepared thousands of meals over 32 years. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence. I know you're angry, he finally said. But anger fades. Love endures. We can get through this if we work together. I don't love you anymore. The words came out of my mouth before I'd consciously decided to say them, but as soon as I heard myself speak, I realized they were true. Whatever love I'd felt for Richard had been killed by his betrayal, by his manipulation, by his casual dismissal of my worth as a human being. He stared at me like I'd slapped him. You don't mean that. I do mean it. I loved the man I thought you were. But that man never existed, did he? That man was a fiction I created to make sense of a marriage that was always about your needs, never mine. 32 years don't just disappear, Margaret. No, they don't. But they don't justify staying in a marriage that's become abusive either. Abusive? I never hit you. I never called you names. You stole from me. You lied to me. You're trying to manipulate our daughter into having me declared mentally incompetent so you can maintain control over me. If that's not abuse, what is? Richard pushed his plate away and stood up abruptly. I'm trying to save our marriage, and you're accusing me of abuse. I'm trying to work things out, and you're talking about divorce. Fine. If that's how you want to play this, we'll play it your way. What does that mean? It means you're going to discover that divorce is expensive and complicated and takes a long time. It means you're going to find out how difficult it is to survive on your own at your age. It means you might start appreciating what you had before you threw it away. Is that a threat? It's reality. Margaret, you think I'm the problem, but I'm actually the solution. Without me, you have no income except that part-time library job. Without me, you can't afford to keep this house. Without me, you're just another lonely old woman with no family support and no future. He left the kitchen, leaving his dirty dishes on the table for me to clean up like I'd been doing for 32 years. But this time, I didn't clean them. I left them sitting there as evidence of who he really was, a man who expected service even while threatening the person providing it. That night, I lay in my bed. Richard had taken the guest room, staring at the ceiling and thinking about everything he'd said. Some of it was true. Divorce would be expensive and complicated. Living alone at 71 would be challenging. My income was minimal. But everything difficult about being independent had to be weighed against everything toxic about staying married to a man who saw me as a resource to be exploited rather than a person to be respected. I thought about David, about the promise I'd made him. I thought about my mother, who'd stayed married to an unfaithful, financially irresponsible man for 43 years because divorce was shameful in her generation. I thought about all the women throughout history who'd endured abuse because the alternatives seemed worse. Then I thought about my grandmother, my mother's mother, who'd left her first husband in 1942 when divorce was scandalous and single women had few options. She'd raised 3 children alone, worked as a seamstress, lived in a tiny apartment, and never remarried. But she'd been free. She'd maintained her dignity. She'd shown her daughters and granddaughters that being alone was better than being mistreated. I fell asleep thinking about my grandmother's courage and woke up determined to find some of that courage for myself. The next morning, Richard was gone when I came downstairs. His coffee mug was in the sink, but there was no note explaining where he'd gone or when he'd be back. For all I knew, he was at Resorts World again, gambling away whatever money he could access from our accounts. I made myself breakfast and then did something I'd been putting off for weeks. I called David's best friend from college, Marcus, who was a lawyer in Manhattan. Marcus had always been kind to me, had stayed in touch with David throughout their adult lives, had delivered a beautiful eulogy at David's funeral. If anyone would help me understand my legal options, it would be him. "Mrs. Thompson," he said when his secretary put me through. "How are you holding up?" "Not well, Marcus. I need some legal advice, and I was hoping you might be able to help." "Of course. What's going on?" I explained the situation as clearly and objectively as I could. Marcus listened without interrupting, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "I'm sorry this is happening to you," he said when I finished. "What Richard did was definitely financial abuse. The question is, what remedies are available to you? Can I get my money back? Probably not. If he gambled it away, it's gone. But you can file for divorce and request that the court award you a larger share of any remaining marital assets to compensate for what he took." "What if there aren't any remaining assets?" "Then you'll need to focus on protecting whatever income and property you have left. The court can order him to pay alimony, but if he doesn't have money, that order won't be worth much. He's threatening to have me declared incompetent." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "That would be very difficult to do unless you actually are mentally impaired, which you clearly aren't. But the threat itself is a form of psychological abuse. Document everything he says, every threat he makes. Keep records. How much will a divorce cost? That depends on how contested it is. If Richard fights everything, it could cost tens of thousands of dollars. If it's uncontested, maybe $5,000. $5,000. Money I no longer had thanks to Richard's gambling. I can't afford that much. There are legal aid organizations that help low-income people with divorce proceedings. I can give you some referrals. Low-income people. That's what I was now, despite working my entire adult life and saving money for decades. Richard's addiction had made me indigent overnight. Marcus gave me phone numbers for 3 legal aid organizations in Brooklyn. He also offered to consult on my case pro bono, as a favor to David's memory. "David loved you very much, Mrs. Thompson. He talked about you all the time, about how proud he was of your strength and independence. He wouldn't want you to stay in a situation where you're being abused." After we hung up, I spent the morning calling the legal aid numbers Marcus had given me. The first organization had a 6-month waiting list. The second was only taking cases involving domestic violence, and the intake worker wasn't sure financial abuse qualified. The third was willing to see me, but not for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of continuing to live with a man who'd stolen from me, who was threatening to have me committed, who saw my presence in my own home as an inconvenience to be managed. But what choice did I have? That afternoon, I went to work at the library. It was my first day back since discovering Richard's betrayal, and I was grateful for the routine, for something to focus on besides my own problems. My supervisor, Janet, noticed that I seemed distracted. "Are you okay, Margaret? I know you're still grieving David." "I'm having some personal difficulties," I said. "Nothing I can't handle." But Janet had known me for 8 years. She could tell something was seriously wrong. "Do you want to talk about it? Sometimes it helps to get things out in the open." So I told her. I told her about Richard's gambling, about the stolen money, about his threats and Sarah's lack of support. Janet listened with growing horror. "Oh, Margaret, I'm so sorry. What are you going to do?" "I'm trying to get a divorce, but it's complicated." "Do you have somewhere to stay? Somewhere safe?" Safe. I hadn't thought about physical safety, but Janet was right to ask. Richard hadn't threatened violence, but men who felt cornered sometimes became dangerous. "I don't know. I don't have much money, and my family isn't supportive." "You could stay with me for a while," Janet offered. "I have a spare bedroom. It's not much, but you'd be welcome." The kindness in her voice, the genuine concern from someone who had no obligation to help me, brought tears to my eyes. "That's very generous, but I can't impose." "You wouldn't be imposing. You'd be accepting help from a friend who cares about you." A friend. When had Janet become a friend rather than just a coworker? When had her small acts of consideration over the years added up to genuine affection? "Let me think about it," I said. But I was already thinking about it. I was thinking about how much better I'd slept the 3 nights Richard had been gone, how much more peaceful my house felt when he wasn't in it, how much less anxious I was when I didn't have to worry about what lie he'd tell next or what money he'd steal. That evening, I came home to find Richard sitting in the living room with a glass of whiskey, waiting for me like a spider in its web. "How was work?" he asked, as if we were a normal couple having a normal conversation. "Fine." "I spoke to Sarah again today." My stomach clenched. "And?" "She's coming for dinner tomorrow. She wants to talk to both of us about the situation." "What situation?" "Our marriage, your behavior, the decisions we need to make as a family." The decisions we needed to make as a family. Not the decisions I needed to make about my own life. Not recognition of my right to determine my own future. The decisions we needed to make, as if my autonomy was subject to family vote. "I don't want to have dinner with Sarah." "Why?" "Because she might say things you don't want to hear?" "Because she's already made it clear whose side she's on, and it's not mine." There shouldn't be sides, Margaret. We're all family. Family. The word that had been used to manipulate me for decades. Family obligations, family loyalty, family first. But where was my family when I needed support? Where was their loyalty when I'd been betrayed? "Family members don't steal from each other," I said. "Family members forgive each other's mistakes." "Mistakes? Richard, you didn't leave the milk out overnight or forget to take out the trash. You systematically stole $53,000 from your grieving wife and gambled it away. That's not a mistake. That's a crime. Are you planning to have me arrested?" The question hung in the air between us. Was I planning to file criminal charges against my husband of 32 years, the father of my children, the man I'd once loved enough to promise to spend my life with? "I'm planning to divorce you," I said. "What happens after that depends on what you do next." Richard drained his whiskey glass and set it down on the coffee table without using a coaster, leaving a ring on the wood I'd polished for decades. "Sarah will be here at 6 tomorrow. I expect you to be civil." "You expect?" "Yes. I expect you to remember that she's your daughter, that she loves you, and that she's trying to help." "Help with what?" "Help you understand what you're throwing away." I went to bed that night thinking about expectations. Richard expected me to be civil to the daughter who'd called me dramatic for objecting to being robbed. Sarah expected me to work out my problems with the husband who'd stolen my life savings. Everyone had expectations of me, demands they felt entitled to make. But what about my expectations? What about my right to demand honesty, respect, basic human decency? When had my needs become negotiable while everyone else's remained absolute? The next morning, I called Janet at the library. "I'd like to take you up on your offer," I said, "if it's still open." "Of course it is. Do you want me to help you pack?" "I don't want to take much. Just some clothes and personal items." "Whatever you need. I'll pick you up after work." Packing was harder than I'd expected. Every item I chose represented a decision about what kind of future I was planning for myself. Would I need my winter coats if I was starting over somewhere warmer? Should I take the photo albums if they were filled with pictures of people who'd betrayed me? What about my books, my kitchen gadgets, the small decorations I'd collected over 32 years? In the end, I packed 2 suitcases and a box of photographs, mostly pictures of David, but some of Sarah as a child, before she'd learned to see me as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be loved. Richard was in the kitchen when Janet arrived. I introduced them briefly, watching his face cycle through surprise, anger, and something that might have been panic. He was losing control of the situation, and he didn't like it. "Where are you going?" he asked as I carried my suitcases to Janet's car. "Somewhere I can think clearly." "What about dinner with Sarah?" "Tell her I'm not available." "You can't just leave. We have things to work out." "No, Richard, you have things to work out. Your gambling addiction, your relationship with reality, your understanding of what marriage means. None of that requires my presence." Sarah's going to be very disappointed. Sarah will have to learn to deal with disappointment. It's an important life skill. I got into Janet's car without looking back. As we drove away from the house I'd called home for 15 years, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: hope. Janet's apartment was small but comfortable, located in a converted brownstone in Fort Greene. My bedroom was tiny, barely big enough for a single bed and dresser, but it had a window facing east that filled with morning light. "It's perfect," I told her. "I'm glad you like it. Stay as long as you need to." That first evening in Janet's apartment, we ordered Chinese food and talked until after midnight. I told her things I'd never told anyone, about the loneliness of my marriage, about feeling invisible in my own family, about the guilt I carried over David's death. "You didn't kill your son," Janet said firmly. "Cancer killed your son. You gave him extra months of life, extra time with the people he loved. That was a gift, not a mistake." Richard said I was selfish for pushing him to keep fighting. Richard said that because he wanted to hurt you, not because it was true. He found your deepest wound and attacked it. That's what abusive people do. Abusive people. Janet didn't hesitate to use that word, didn't qualify it or soften it. Richard was abusive, and I was his victim, and there was no shame in acknowledging that reality. The next morning, I woke up in Janet's spare bedroom feeling rested for the first time in weeks. No wondering what Richard might have done during the night. No walking on eggshells to avoid triggering his anger. No responsibility for managing someone else's emotions or covering for their lies. Just quiet. Just peace. Just the possibility of a life lived on my own terms. My phone had 17 missed calls from Richard and 4 from Sarah. The voicemails ranged from pleading to furious. Richard demanded that I come home immediately. Sarah accused me of being selfish and dramatic. I deleted all the messages without listening to them completely. That afternoon, I had my first appointment with the legal aid lawyer. Her name was Patricia Collins, and she was younger than Sarah but carried herself with quiet authority. Her office was cramped and cluttered, but she gave me her complete attention as I explained my situation. $53,000 is a significant amount, she said when I finished. Have you considered filing criminal charges? I don't know if I want to do that. Why not? It was a fair question. Why was I protecting a man who'd shown no consideration for me? I suppose because we were married. because sending him to prison won't get my money back. But it might prevent him from doing this to someone else. I hadn't thought about that. The possibility that Richard might find another vulnerable woman to exploit might charm his way into someone else's savings account. "Let me think about it," I said. Patricia spent an hour explaining the divorce process, the timeline, the likely costs. Even with legal aid, I'd need to pay court filing fees and other expenses. About $800 total if Richard didn't contest anything, possibly much more if he fought. "Based on what you've told me, I think we can make a strong case for you getting the house and whatever other assets remain. The gambling and financial abuse will work in your favor. What if he claims I'm mentally incompetent? Do you have any diagnosed mental health conditions? Any cognitive impairment? No. Then he can claim whatever he wants. It won't hold up in court without medical evidence." I left Patricia's office feeling more confident than I had in weeks. I had legal representation, a plan for moving forward, and a place to stay while the divorce proceeded. For the first time since David's death, I felt like I might have a future. That evening, Sarah called Janet's apartment. "Mom, what are you doing? Dad is beside himself. He says you've moved out, that you're talking about divorce." "I have moved out, and I am talking about divorce." "Over money? You're going to destroy our family over money?" "I'm going to protect myself from further abuse. If that destroys the family, it's because the family was built on my exploitation." "That's ridiculous. Dad made a mistake. People make mistakes." "People make mistakes, Sarah. They don't make systematic months-long plans to steal their spouse's life savings. That's not a mistake. That's a choice." "He's getting help. He's going to Gamblers Anonymous. Good for him. He should get help. But that doesn't mean I have to stay married to him while he does it." "What about your vows? What about for better or worse? What about his vows? What about the part where he promised to love, honor, and cherish me? When did he last do any of those things?" Sarah was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller, more uncertain. "I don't want our family to fall apart." "Our family fell apart when your father decided to steal from me instead of talking to me about his problems. I didn't cause this, and I can't fix it. Where are you staying?" "With a friend." "What friend? I don't know any of your friends." That statement should have been shocking, but it wasn't. Sarah didn't know my friends because I didn't have friends. I'd spent 32 years being so focused on my family's needs that I'd never developed relationships outside of marriage and motherhood, except for Janet. Kind, generous Janet who'd offered me shelter when my own daughter wouldn't. "You don't need to know where I am, Sarah. I'm safe, and I'm making decisions about my own life." "Dad thinks you might hurt yourself." "Dad is projecting his own guilt onto me. I have no intention of hurting myself. In fact, for the first time in months, I'm focused on protecting myself." "Can't you just come home and work things out?" "There's nothing to work out. Your father is a gambling addict who stole my life savings and then blamed me for being upset about it. That's not a marriage problem. That's a crime problem." I hung up before she could argue further. Then I turned off my phone so neither she nor Richard could call me back. 3 days later, I was shelving books at the library when Janet approached me with a concerned expression. "Margaret, there's a man here asking about you. He says he's your husband." My blood went cold. "Is he angry? He seems upset. I told him you weren't available, but he insisted on waiting." I looked toward the front desk and saw Richard sitting in one of the reading chairs staring at me. Even from across the room, I could see the tension in his posture, the barely controlled anger in his face. "I'll handle this," I told Janet. I walked over to Richard slowly, trying to project calm confidence even though my heart was racing. "You need to leave," I said quietly. "This is my workplace." "Your workplace? You mean this part-time job that pays you practically nothing?" This is what you chose over our marriage? Several library patrons looked up from their books. Richard was speaking loudly enough to draw attention, which I suspected was intentional. He was trying to embarrass me, to force me into submission through public humiliation. I chose dignity over abuse, I said, keeping my voice low. I chose self-respect over exploitation. Exploitation. I supported you for 32 years. I gave you a home, a family, a life. And you're calling that exploitation? You supported me. Richard, I worked throughout our marriage. I contributed to the household income, managed the home, raised our children. What exactly did you give me that I didn't earn? A marriage, a partnership. Partnership. Is that what you call systematically stealing from your partner? Is that what you call lying and gambling and threatening to have your partner committed? Richard's face flushed red. He stood up abruptly, towering over me in a way that felt threatening. You're destroying everything, he hissed. Our marriage, our family, our children's respect for their mother. For what? Money that's already gone? For my right to be treated like a human being instead of a resource to be exploited. I never exploited you. You stole $53,000 from me, Richard, after our son died, while I was grieving. How is that not exploitation? Several library patrons were openly staring now. Janet appeared at my elbow, her presence offering support. Sir, you need to keep your voice down or leave the building, she said firmly. Richard looked at Janet with contempt. Who are you to tell me what to do? This is between me and my wife. This is my library, and you're disturbing other patrons. Lower your voice or leave. I watched Richard calculate his options. He could make a bigger scene and probably get himself banned from the library permanently. Or he could retreat and try a different approach. He chose retreat, but not gracefully. This isn't over, Margaret. You can't hide from your responsibilities forever. After he left, I stood in the middle of the library, shaking. Several patrons approached to ask if I was okay, to offer help if I needed it. Their kindness almost brought me to tears. Are you all right? Janet asked. I think so, but I'm worried about what he might do next. That evening, Janet and I talked about safety planning. We researched domestic violence resources, even though Richard hadn't been physically violent. Financial abuse and emotional manipulation often escalated, especially when the abuser felt they were losing control. You should document everything, Janet advised. Every threat, every contact, every incident. If this gets worse, you'll need evidence. I started a journal that night, writing down everything I could remember about Richard's behavior over the past few months. The lies, the manipulation, the theft, the threats. Reading it back, I was shocked by the pattern of abuse I'd been enduring without even recognizing it as such. 2 weeks later, Patricia called with news. Richard's lawyer contacted me, she said. They want to negotiate. What kind of negotiation? Richard is willing to agree to an uncontested divorce if you'll drop any claims for compensation for the money he took. Absolutely not. I told them you'd say that. They came back with another offer. He'll give you the house free and clear if you'll sign a confidentiality agreement. A confidentiality agreement. Richard wanted to buy my silence, to prevent me from telling people what he'd done to me. What does that mean exactly? It means you couldn't discuss the financial abuse publicly. You couldn't tell friends, family members, even future romantic partners about what happened in your marriage. He wants me to lie for him. He wants to protect his reputation. I thought about David, about the promise I'd made him, about my grandmother, who'd left an abusive marriage when it was scandalous to do so, about all the women who'd stayed silent about abuse because their reputations mattered more than their dignity. No, I said. I won't sign anything that requires me to lie about what he did to me. That's what I expected you to say. I'll tell his lawyer we're not interested. The divorce proceedings moved slowly through the court system. Richard continued to live in our house, but I stayed with Janet. I was sleeping better, eating better, feeling stronger every day. My life was smaller than it had been. No house to maintain, no husband to manage, no family dinners to coordinate. But it was also more peaceful. I started spending my free time reading again, something I'd given up years ago because Richard complained that I wasn't paying attention to him when I had a book in my hands. I rediscovered my love for mystery novels, for biographies of strong women, for poetry that spoke to experiences I was only now allowing myself to acknowledge. Janet and I developed routines together. Saturday morning coffee and newspaper reading. Sunday afternoon walks through Prospect Park. Weeknight dinners where we talked about books, politics, our dreams for the future. I realized I'd never had a friendship like this. Equal, reciprocal, based on mutual respect and genuine affection. 3 months after leaving Richard, I was walking to work when my phone rang. It was Sarah. "Mom, I need to tell you something." Her voice sounded different, smaller, more uncertain than usual. "What is it?" "I found out where Dad's been getting money since you left." My stomach clenched. "Where?" "He's been selling things from your house, your grandmother's china, your mother's jewelry, some of your books. He put an ad on Craigslist." I stopped walking and sat down on a nearby bench. Richard was selling my possessions, my inheritance from the women in my family, items that held memories and meaning beyond their monetary value. "Are you sure?" "I saw the ad. He's calling it estate sale items, but I recognize the descriptions." "Mom, I'm so sorry. I didn't know he was doing this." "How much has he sold?" "I don't know, but the ad's been up for weeks. My grandmother's china, given to me on my wedding day with the promise that I'd pass it down to my own daughter someday. My mother's jewelry, worn to church every Sunday for 40 years. My collection of first edition books, accumulated over decades of careful hunting in used bookstores. All of it sold to strangers to fund Richard's gambling addiction or pay for lawyers to fight our divorce. "Sarah, I need you to do something for me." "What?" "I need you to go to the house and take pictures of whatever's left. Document what he's sold, what condition the house is in. Can you do that?" "Yes. Mom, I'm really sorry. I know I haven't been supportive, but I'm starting to understand what you've been going through." Starting to understand. After months of calling me dramatic and selfish, Sarah was starting to understand that her father was systematically destroying everything I'd worked to build. That evening, Sarah sent me dozens of photos. The house looked like it was being stripped for parts. Bare walls where my artwork used to hang. Empty shelves where my books had been displayed. The dining room table was gone. The table where we'd eaten thousands of family meals together. But the most devastating loss was my mother's sewing room. I'd kept it exactly as she'd left it when she died 10 years ago. Her machine, her fabric collection, her patterns and notions and all the tools of her craft. It was a shrine to her memory, a place where I could still feel connected to her. Richard had sold everything. The antique sewing machine, the vintage fabric, even the small rocking chair where my mother used to sit while hand-stitching quilts for her grandchildren. I cried that night harder than I'd cried since David's funeral. Not just for the lost possessions, but for what they represented. Richard wasn't just stealing money from me. He was erasing my history, destroying my connection to the women who'd shaped me, eliminating any physical evidence of the life I'd built before I married him. The next morning, I called Patricia. "He's selling my personal property," I said. "Family heirlooms, inherited items, things that were never marital assets." "That's another form of abuse," Patricia said grimly. "We can ask for an emergency court order to stop him, but getting your property back might be difficult if it's already been sold." "I want to file criminal charges." "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. He's stolen money from me, and now he's stealing property. This has to stop." Filing criminal charges against my husband felt surreal. I sat in a police station in downtown Brooklyn, giving a statement to a detective who looked younger than my son would have been. I explained about the bank accounts, the gambling, the property sales. I provided documentation, bank statements, photos, Richard's own admissions of guilt. "This is definitely criminal behavior," the detective assured me. "We'll investigate and probably file charges within the week." When I left the police station, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Power. For the first time since discovering Richard's betrayal, I was fighting back instead of just enduring. I was refusing to be a victim. The arrest happened on a Wednesday morning. Sarah called me crying. "They arrested Dad at his office," she sobbed. "Everyone saw. His co-workers, his boss. He's been fired." I should have felt sorry for him. 32 years of marriage, 2 children together, decades of shared history. I should have felt something other than grim satisfaction. But I didn't. Richard had systematically destroyed my financial security, my emotional well-being, my family relationships, my sense of self-worth. He'd gambled away my future and then sold my past to fund his addiction. His public humiliation was a natural consequence of his own choices. "I'm sorry you had to see that," I told Sarah. "But your father brought this on himself. Can't you drop the charges? Can't you give him another chance?" Another chance. How many chances was I supposed to give a man who saw my forgiveness as permission to continue abusing me? "No, Sarah. I can't and won't drop the charges. But he's my father. And I'm your mother. The mother he stole from, lied to, and emotionally abused while I was grieving your brother's death. Where was your concern for me when I needed support?" Sarah was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know. I guess I thought you were strong enough to handle anything. I never thought about what you might need." Strong enough to handle anything. It was supposed to be a compliment, but it felt like a curse. I'd been so strong, so capable, so endlessly resilient that my own family had forgotten I was human. They'd expected me to absorb whatever damage they inflicted and keep functioning, keep giving, keep serving their needs while my own went unmet. "I am strong," I told Sarah. "Strong enough to refuse to be abused anymore. Strong enough to demand the respect I've earned. Strong enough to choose my own well-being over other people's comfort." Richard was released on bail the next day. His lawyer called Patricia immediately, asking for another negotiation. "Now they're offering you everything," Patricia told me. "The house, his retirement account, even a commitment to pay off the credit card debt he accumulated gambling." "In exchange for dropping the criminal charges?" "Yes." I thought about it for 3 days. The practical part of my brain said to take the deal. I'd get financial security, a place to live, some compensation for what I'd lost. The criminal charges would disappear, and I could move on with my life. But the part of my brain that remembered my grandmother's courage said something different. It said that buying my silence was just another form of control, another way for Richard to avoid accountability for his actions. "I'm not dropping the charges," I told Patricia. "Even if it means getting less in the divorce settlement?" Even then, what he did was criminal. He should face criminal consequences. Richard's trial was scheduled for 6 months later. In the meantime, I continued living with Janet, working at the library, building a life that belonged entirely to me. I started taking painting classes at a community center in Fort Greene. I hadn't painted since high school, but I discovered I still remembered how to see color and light, how to translate emotion into brushstrokes. My paintings were amateurish, but they were mine. They expressed feelings I'd kept hidden for decades. I also started volunteering at a domestic violence shelter, helping other women navigate the legal system and find resources for starting over. Many of them were my age or older, women whose families had exploited their caregiving nature until they had nothing left to give. "How do you find the courage to start over?" one woman asked me. She was 73, had been married for 51 years to a man who'd controlled every aspect of her life. You remember that you've survived everything that's happened to you so far, I told her. You remember that you're stronger than you know, and you remember that being alone is better than being mistreated. The night before Richard's trial, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about David, about the promise I'd made him to never let anyone take advantage of me again. I'd kept that promise, but at enormous cost. I'd lost my marriage, most of my family relationships, my financial security, my home. But I'd gained something too. I'd gained my dignity. I'd gained the knowledge that I was capable of standing up for myself, even when it was difficult and painful and lonely. I'd gained the friendship of people who valued me for who I was, not what I could do for them. The trial lasted 3 days. I testified about the financial abuse, the emotional manipulation, the theft of my property. Richard's lawyer tried to portray me as a vindictive ex-wife seeking revenge, but the evidence was overwhelming. Financial records showing the systematic theft from my accounts. Photos of my house stripped of everything valuable. Testimony from Sarah about her father's lies and manipulations. Even testimony from Richard's former co-workers about his erratic behavior and unexplained absences. Richard was convicted on multiple charges: elder abuse, theft, fraud. The judge sentenced him to 2 years in prison, 5 years of probation, and ordered him to pay full restitution for everything he'd stolen from me. Mr. Thompson, the judge said during sentencing, you violated the most basic trust that exists between married partners. You exploited your wife's love and loyalty to fund your gambling addiction. The law exists to protect vulnerable people from exactly this kind of abuse. Vulnerable people. Even the judge recognized what my own family had refused to see: that I'd been vulnerable after David's death, and Richard had deliberately exploited that vulnerability. After the sentencing, Sarah approached me in the courthouse hallway. Mom, I owe you an apology. A big one. Yes, you do. I was wrong about everything. I was wrong to call you dramatic. I was wrong to refuse to help you. I was wrong to think you should just forgive and forget what Dad did to you. Why did it take a criminal conviction for you to understand that? Sarah was quiet for a moment, tears streaming down her face. Because I didn't want to believe that Dad was capable of what he did to you. Because admitting he was abusive meant admitting that I'd failed to protect my own mother when she needed me most. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her for the first time in months. She was 47 years old, struggling with her own marriage troubles, struggling to raise teenagers and manage a career and care for aging parents. She'd failed me when I needed her most, but she was human. Humans make mistakes, even terrible ones. I accept your apology, I said. But I need you to understand that my relationship with your father is over permanently. I won't be visiting him in prison. I won't be taking his phone calls. I won't be resuming our marriage when he's released. I understand. And I need you to understand that rebuilding our relationship will take time. You hurt me deeply when you refused to support me. I know. I want to do better. Then start by respecting my decisions. Start by treating me like a person whose feelings matter, not just a mother who exists to serve everyone else's needs. 6 months later, I moved back into the house that had been awarded to me in the divorce settlement. It felt strange at first, walking through rooms where Richard had lived and lied and stolen from me. But gradually, I began transforming the space into something that reflected who I was becoming rather than who I'd been. I turned Richard's office into an art studio. I painted the walls bright colors: yellow in the kitchen, lavender in my bedroom, sage green in the living room. I bought new furniture, not because I could afford it, but because I deserved to live in a space that felt welcoming and comfortable. I kept David's room exactly as it had been. That wasn't about living in the past. It was about honoring his memory and the love we'd shared. Sarah and I began having lunch together once a month. Our relationship was different than it had been, more careful, more equal. She treated me with the respect due to an independent adult, rather than the casual dismissal she'd shown when she thought I had no choice but to accept whatever treatment she offered. My grandchildren started visiting again. They were awkward at first, confused by the changes in our family, uncertain about how to relate to a grandmother who was no longer focused entirely on their comfort and convenience. But children adapt quickly. They learned that I was still interested in their lives, still willing to provide support and guidance, but that I also had boundaries. I wouldn't be manipulated or taken for granted. I wouldn't sacrifice my well-being for anyone else's ease. Janet and I remained close friends. She'd given me shelter when I needed it most, had shown me what genuine friendship looked like. We traveled together, small trips at first, weekend getaways to places I'd always wanted to see but had never prioritized because Richard wasn't interested. A year after Richard's conviction, I received a letter from him in prison. He claimed to have found God, to be attending Gamblers Anonymous meetings, to be ready to apologize and make amends for what he'd done to me. I threw the letter away without finishing it. 2 weeks later, he called. Prison allowed inmates to make collect calls, but the recipient had to accept the charges. When the automated system said a call from Richard Thompson, I hung up. He tried calling several more times over the following months. Sometimes I answered just long enough to hang up. Sometimes I didn't answer at all. Sarah asked me once why I wouldn't talk to him. Because there's nothing he could say that would change what he did to me, I explained. Because forgiveness isn't something he gets to demand, and redemption isn't something he gets to perform for my benefit. But maybe he's genuinely changed. Maybe he has. That's good for him and for anyone who chooses to have a relationship with him in the future. But it doesn't obligate me to give him another chance to hurt me. Don't you think everyone deserves forgiveness? I think everyone deserves consequences for their actions. I think victims deserve the right to choose whether and when and how to forgive. And I think forgiveness is about peace for the person who gives it, not absolution for the person who receives it. I had found peace. Not the peace of forgetting what Richard had done to me, but the peace of knowing I'd fought back. The peace of knowing I'd refused to let his abuse define the rest of my life. The peace of knowing I was strong enough to survive on my own. On the second anniversary of David's death, I visited his grave for the first time since the funeral. I'd been too raw, too overwhelmed by grief and betrayal to handle the additional emotional weight. But now I was ready. I brought flowers, white roses, his favorite, and sat beside his headstone for an hour, telling him about everything that had changed since he died. I kept my promise, I whispered. I didn't let anyone take advantage of me after you were gone. It was harder than I expected, but I kept my promise. The wind rustled through the trees surrounding the cemetery, and for a moment I could almost imagine it was David's voice telling me he was proud. That evening, I painted. I'd been working on a series of self-portraits, not literal likenesses, but emotional representations of different stages of my journey. The painting I worked on that night was of a woman standing in sunlight, her face turned toward the sky, her arms outstretched in celebration or gratitude or simple relief. I was 73 years old. I lived alone in a house I owned outright, in a neighborhood where I'd built genuine friendships with people who valued my company. I had enough money to be comfortable, if not wealthy. I had a daughter who was learning to respect me, and grandchildren who were learning that love didn't mean exploitation. I had survived the worst betrayal I could imagine and discovered I was stronger than I'd ever known. 3 years after Richard's conviction, I was at the grocery store when I saw a familiar face in the checkout line ahead of me. An older woman, maybe my age, paying for groceries with food stamps while a younger man beside her tapped impatiently at his phone. When she struggled to carry her bags, the man walked ahead without offering to help. When she asked him to slow down so she could keep up, he snapped at her about having other places to be. When she tried to tell him about a doctor's appointment she needed help getting to, he interrupted to complain about his own problems. I watched this interaction with growing recognition. I saw myself 3 years ago, Invisible, unheard, taken for granted by someone who should have been protecting me instead of exploiting me. After the man drove away, leaving the woman standing alone with no way to get her groceries home, I approached her. "Excuse me," I said. "I'm driving past the senior housing complex. Can I give you a ride?" Her name was Helen. She was 78 years old, and the man was her son. Over the 15-minute drive to her apartment, I learned that she'd been supporting him financially for years, while he showed her nothing but impatience and contempt. "I know he doesn't mean to be unkind," she said sadly. "He's just stressed about work." I heard my own voice from years past, making excuses for people who didn't deserve them. "Would you like to have coffee sometime?" I asked as I helped her carry her groceries upstairs. Helen looked surprised. "You'd want to have coffee with me?" "I'd enjoy the company, and I have some experiences I think you might relate to." We started meeting for coffee once a week. Helen reminded me of myself before I'd learned to value my own worth. She was kind, generous, endlessly giving, and completely unable to see that her kindness was being exploited. Slowly, carefully, I began sharing my story. I told her about Richard's betrayal, about Sarah's initial lack of support, about the legal battle, and the long process of rebuilding my life. I told her about learning the difference between being loving and being used. "But how did you find the courage to fight back?" Helen asked one afternoon. "I remembered that my son wanted me to be safe and respected," I said. "I remembered that I was worth fighting for, even if no one else seemed to think so." Helen was quiet for a long time. Then, so softly I almost couldn't hear her. "I don't think anyone would fight for me." "I would," I said. "I'm here, and I'm listening, and I believe you deserve better than what you're getting." It took Helen 8 months to find the courage to set boundaries with her son. 8 months of weekly coffee conversations, of gentle encouragement, of practical support as she learned to say no to his demands for money and yes to her own needs. When her son realized his access to her resources was being restricted, he reacted with predictable anger. He accused her of being selfish, of not caring about family, of choosing strangers over her own son. "That sounds familiar," I told Helen after she described the confrontation. "What did you do when your family said things like that?" "I remembered that people who truly love you don't punish you for having boundaries. I remembered that being related to someone doesn't give them the right to mistreat you." Helen was stronger than she'd believed. Once she started standing up for herself, she discovered reserves of courage she didn't know she possessed. She joined a seniors advocacy group, started volunteering at a literacy center, began taking art classes. 6 months ago, she moved into a smaller apartment that she could afford on her own income. Her son still calls occasionally, still tries to manipulate her into giving him money, but she's learned to recognize manipulation for what it is. "I never thought I could be happy living alone," she told me recently. "But I'm happier than I've been in years." Watching Helen's transformation reminded me of my own journey. The terror of those first days after leaving Richard. The overwhelming uncertainty of divorce proceedings. The slow, painful process of learning to trust my own judgment again. But also the gradual emergence of strength I didn't know I had. The joy of making decisions based on my own preferences instead of other people's demands. The peace of living without constantly walking on eggshells or managing someone else's emotions. I'm 75 now. My hair is completely gray, and I don't bother dyeing it anymore. My hands are arthritic, and climbing stairs is harder than it used to be. But I wake up every morning in my own house, make coffee the way I like it, spend my day doing things that matter to me. Sarah and I have lunch once a month. Our relationship will never be what it was before I understood how little she valued me, but it's honest now. She treats me with respect, asks about my life, includes me in family decisions that affect me. My grandchildren are young adults now, making their own way in the world. They come to visit not because they need something from me, but because they enjoy my company. They ask my advice about college, about relationships, about the challenges of becoming independent in an expensive city. I tell them what I wish someone had told me at their age. That love without respect isn't really love. That kindness without boundaries enables cruelty. That taking care of yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. Richard was released from prison 18 months ago. I heard through Sarah that he moved to Florida, started over in a place where no one knew about his crimes. I don't know if he's still gambling, if he's found someone new to exploit, if he's genuinely changed or just become better at hiding his problems. I don't care. His story is no longer connected to mine except through shared history and shared children. Whatever redemption or destruction awaits him is his responsibility, not mine. Last month, I got a letter from a woman in Ohio who'd read about my case online. Her husband had been stealing from her retirement account to fund a drug addiction, and she was struggling with whether to file criminal charges. "Everyone tells me I should forgive him and work things out," she wrote. "They say marriage is about forgiveness. But I don't think I can ever trust him again. Did you struggle with the same feelings?" I wrote back that afternoon. I told her about David's warning, about the promise I'd made him, about the long road from victim to survivor. I told her that forgiveness was a choice she could make for her own peace, but that it didn't require her to stay in a dangerous situation or accept continued abuse. "You deserve to be safe," I wrote. "You deserve to have your boundaries respected. You deserve to live without fear of being exploited by someone who claims to love you. Trust yourself. You know what you need to do." I included my phone number and told her to call if she needed someone to listen who would understand. She called 3 days later. We talked for 2 hours. By the end of our conversation, she'd decided to contact a lawyer. I've gotten 4 more letters since then, from women in similar situations. Each time I respond. Each time I offer whatever support and encouragement I can. Each time I remember how alone I felt when I was trying to figure out how to escape Richard's abuse. Maybe this is my purpose now. Maybe surviving my own ordeal was preparation for helping other women survive theirs. Maybe my story matters not just because it's mine, but because it's also theirs. Yesterday was David's birthday. He would have been 40 today. I spent the morning at his grave and the afternoon painting a portrait of him from memory. Not as a sick young man dying in a hospital bed, but as a healthy child laughing on a swing set, full of joy and possibility. While I painted, I thought about the promise I'd made him. I thought about how keeping that promise had cost me my marriage, my financial security, most of my family relationships. I thought about how it had also given me my dignity, my independence, my sense of self-worth. I thought about the woman I was 3 years ago, scared, isolated, convinced I had no choice but to accept whatever treatment I received. I thought about the woman I am now, strong, confident, surrounded by people who value me for who I am rather than what I can do for them. The transformation wasn't easy. There were days when I wondered if I'd made the right choice, if the cost of freedom was too high, if I was destined to spend my remaining years alone and struggling. But those days became fewer and farther between. As I built a life based on mutual respect rather than exploitation, as I formed friendships based on genuine affection rather than obligation, as I learned to make decisions based on my own needs rather than other people's demands, the loneliness I'd feared turned out to be solitude I treasured. I am alone, but I am not lonely. I am independent, but I am not isolated. I am older, but I am also stronger. This morning, I woke up in my sunny bedroom, in the house I own, in the life I've built from the ashes of everything I thought I wanted. I made coffee and read the news and planned the day ahead. Lunch with Helen, an afternoon painting class, dinner with Janet. Small pleasures, simple routines, but made precious by the knowledge that they're chosen rather than imposed, that they reflect my preferences rather than someone else's demands, that they're part of a life lived on my own terms. I want to ask you something, and I want you to really think about your answer. Have you ever found yourself making excuses for someone who was mistreating you? Have you ever stayed in a relationship, romantic, familial, or otherwise, because you were afraid of being alone? Have you ever given so much of yourself to other people that you forgot who you were underneath all that service? If any of this story sounds familiar, if you recognize yourself in my journey, or Helen's or that of any woman who's ever discovered that love without respect is just exploitation with better marketing, please know this: you are not alone. You are not crazy. You are not asking for too much when you ask to be treated with basic human dignity. You are strong enough to survive whatever changes you need to make. You are worthy of relationships based on mutual respect, rather than one-sided service. You are valuable as a person, not just as a provider of care or money or emotional support to others. It's never too late to start over. It's never too late to demand better. It's never too late to choose yourself. If this story helped you in any way, if it made you feel less alone in your own struggles, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. Share it with someone who might need to hear it. Together, maybe we can help each other find the courage to claim the lives we deserve. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for letting me share this journey with you. Thank you for reminding me that surviving wasn't enough. I needed to learn how to thrive. And I have. Finally, beautifully, completely. I have learned how to thrive.